Media Matrix. My name's Natalie. I'm here with Cait, Anthony, and Peter. We're sitting down with Professor Stephen Michels, who's a political science professor here at Sacred Heart University. So my first question is, how do you feel about our country's current state of right to privacy?
Not good. I'm a little concerned. There are two sort of different ways to think about it. One is what the government is doing, and the other is what corporations are doing, and I think both of them are probably doing too much. But as we've seen over the last couple of years, there have been some high-profile cases having to do with privacy. The Snowden leaks being maybe the most prominent one, and then the last month we talked about, had this big conversation, public conversation about the iPhone, whether the government can compel a private company to make that information available. So between those two things and the election coming up, I think we have a prime opportunity to revisit some of these questions about civil rights and civil liberties, and especially since Obama has not been good on those issues. He was a constitutional law professor before he became president, and I've been very disappointed at his level of commitment to those issues. So the election, I think, is an opportunity to ask questions of the candidates and to have them commit to a position that protects liberty a little more overtly.
I'd like to jump into it. Firstly, who is Edward Snowden, and do you think that the way that he went about his cause was the right way to go about it?
Okay, he was a private contractor that was working with the CIA and the NSA, and as a result of his security clearances, he became aware of the fact that basically that the government was breaking the law and surveilling citizens in a way that was not permitted. So he sought about basically stealing or obtaining some evidence of these files and then releasing that documentation to some reporters who then proceeded to go through and carefully figure out what would be a security risk to leak, and then those reporters set out to write stories revealing what the government had been doing.
Okay. Do you think that the charge that he was charged with espionage was the correct charge for his
No,
actions?
yeah, to the second part of your question I should have elaborated on. One way to think about what he did and to maybe defend what he did is to contrast it with what Chelsea Manning did, which is basically just take all the documents and release them out to the public. So Snowden was much more careful, much more deliberate in what he did. And the charge, espionage, it's a bit of a stretch, to say the least. It's an old law. Obama has been very aggressive. I think that if Snowden is, or depending on if he's been charged yet, he'll be the seventh person that Obama has used the Espionage Act to indict with. But he was very careful in doing this. And a nice analogy might be, say you have a trunk filled with heroin, and you're about to sell it to children, right? And you're my neighbor, and maybe I have kids, and I go about and I take your heroin from you, and I take it to the police. And I say, look at all this heroin that was about to be put on the street and sold to school kids, and instead they arrest me for theft. That's kind of what's happening to Snowden now, that the government did not have legal authority to obtain what they had been obtaining, and Snowden basically took their heroin and took it to the police, which is the public, or journalists, and said, look at all the bad that the government is doing.
That's a very good analogy.
Edward Snowden, when he leaked things, he leaked many programs the government was using, for example, PRISM. Is there any program that you feel is very controversial for what they did, like the worst?
Yeah, actually, in the follow-up to a lot of the revelations that came about as a result of Snowden, we've been able to have a discussion about the difference between metadata, right? That was what we first thought the government was doing, but actually, it's technically possible, and we've wondered whether the government is actually collecting more than just the metadata. So I think that's a really interesting conversation to have, because it seemed like everyone. The initial defense, and this is what the head of the NSA said to Congress, that about what they were collecting versus what they could collect. So the technology exists for the government to collect a lot more than they are. And we really need to think about what is too much, right? So if we're really concerned about terrorism and security, where does it stop, right? That's a really interesting thing that we need to think about, that our enemies, they have technological capacities, they'll innovate. So we'll never get to a point where we say, okay, we're only collecting this and we don't need to collect any more than that, right? So it's pretty clear that the government, if the rationale and the principles that they've laid out, and the justification for collecting all the data, that it's never going to end, right? There's never going to be a point at which they'll say, "Oh, we're not going to do that," right? If they can do it, they will do it, and I
Push
think
the
that's
envelope as much as they can.
exactly.
And it's also not just the government who's taking our information, on social network media outlets that obtain our information. And we were talking about this in our previous interview, that the profit gains that also come about with corporations in terms of the right to privacy, which is also something that a lot of people don't know.
Yeah. There's been some really interesting research on this too. One in particular, a couple of years ago, was of Facebook users, and the question was, what do you think you're making public?
Yeah.
Right? And the difference between what people thought they were making public versus what they were actually making public was very large. People thought, because Facebook's privacy settings are ridiculous, they're complicated, and they're a little too sophisticated. Also, first of all, you have to find them. Which is hard to do, because they don't want you to set things to private. They want you to share everything. They want you to basically live your life online, and they want to monetize it. I mean, that's primarily the issue. And even for people who are concerned with civil liberties, it's very difficult to live off the grid.
Exactly.
Basically. I mean, it's all social media and technology exists for the sake of convenience. My new iPhone is coming today, by the way, I should say. But with this issue of the iPhone, so whether the government was going to compel Apple to open it or not, like if you save all your data on the cloud, right, the government can access it without Apple, right?
Yeah.
So, and if you wanted to live a life that was untraceable or untrackable, it would be very difficult to do, even if you wanted to.
Exactly.
In today's society, yeah.
And the argument that people have is that, I have nothing to hide, so why does it matter if the government, if they're supposedly, counteracting cyber terrorism, they could go through my Facebook, Twitter, I have nothing to hide. But where does that, obviously there's a danger that falls within that.
Yeah, because really what they're doing when they're collecting all this data is they're looking for patterns of behavior, right?
Yeah.
And you could make yourself a suspect just because you do things that terrorists do. Or maybe you know someone who's given money to a political organization that has reported or rumored to give money to Islamic extremist organizations, right? All of a sudden that might put you on some watch list.
Yeah.
This is why we have a constitution to begin with. The framers thought that this was essential, that we have a right to our privacy, that we have a right to our possessions, that we have a right to keep our home private. The big debate at the time of the founding was not whether we should have privacy or not. It was which government was best able to preserve the privacy. Was it the national government or the states? That was the big debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Everyone was on the side of freedom and privacy. It was just a question of who's going to best preserve it and where the biggest threat was. The advocates of the Constitution thought that we needed a more national government to protect liberty, and the Anti-Federalists thought that the states would do a better job at that. Turns out they were both wrong. That governments of all levels, whether it's the cities, states, or the national government, they're perfectly capable of oppressing, right? But since we have more government, and this is what James Madison says, that they can provide a double security. So sometimes the national government can check the states. Say in the 50s and 60s, when the national government required the schools to be desegregated because people their civil rights were being denied. Right? That was an instance of state governments violating civil rights. And then there might be a time, maybe like now, we see some states experimenting with drug policy. Right? So Colorado and other states realizing that maybe marijuana is not a Schedule I narcotic and it should be decriminalized. So we see those states moving to protect civil liberties and civil rights that way too.
So you take on a completely libertarian view when it comes to national security.
Yeah, I don't make apologies for being on the side of liberty, I think. I think that's, I'm unapologetic that way.
I kind of want to take it another way, and going back to what Peter was saying about Edward Snowden. It's currently known that Edward Snowden's in Russia, obviously. And do you think that he's there because Putin gave him asylum for a different reason other than the fact that he has these government secrets? Or do you think that, why did Putin allow him into Russia?
Well, it's clear that Snowden is not in Russia because he wants to be. I'm sure he would rather be here with his family and his friends, not in exile. And from what I understand, the reason he's there is because that's sort of where he was when he was found out, right? He was in the process of going from one place to another and had his passport revoked. And there are a lot of places, actually probably most places in the world, he just can't go because he'll be apprehended and extradited. And I think that the reason why Putin probably gave him asylum there has more to do with American foreign policy and our relationship with Putin than any relationship Snowden may or may not have with Putin. Snowden has denied giving any information to Russia. In fact, he's been very careful with the information he has, going so far as to encrypt it and only give it to journalists. It seems very inconsistent with how he's operated, that he would do something so careless. And if he did do that, then he would be guilty of violating the Espionage Act, because that's sort of what the law says. And there hasn't been any evidence that he has done that. So it seems to me a little bit speculative, maybe on the part of the people that don't understand what Snowden has done, and it's an attempt to discredit him, basically. So we don't have to have conversations like this.
Do you think conversations like this are necessary? Or
Absolutely, yeah, we should be having them, yeah.
And do you think that the government's doing stuff to make these conversations harder to have, in terms of like putting like political spins on stories like this, like in terms of like the way Fox News reports a story like this, or MSNBC reports a story like this?
Yeah, I think the media has not been helpful. There's been a lot of exaggeration. Fox News in particular has probably not been good on this. For whatever reason, the American people are very fearful, right? Even the Apple iPhone thing. I think 53% of the people thought that Apple should unlock the phone. That once you recognize that fear is a motivating factor, again, it justifies everything. Like, what are we going to do to stop people who want to hurt us, right? Where's the line that we're not willing to cross? It's a very dangerous precedent to set.
So how do you feel about, obviously after 9/11, that's when the Patriot Act came about. And recently, especially after Snowden, more people, he obviously paved the way. He's a pioneer for this conversation. Now you have politicians like Rand Paul, or on the other side, Bernie Sanders, who both overturned the Patriot Act. Do you think that we should continue moving away from the Patriot Act, or do you think there are some elements to the act that we should still have?
Well, the biggest problem with the act, is that it was enacted at a very sensitive time. We had just experienced a massive attack. What a lot of people don't know about the Patriot Act is that it was put together really quickly, right? It's a big act, and it was basically a combination of all these existing laws that were wish lists on the part of the CIA and the intelligence community and the FBI. This is all the things that they wanted to do, but they couldn't do before. So for them, 9/11 was an opportunity to expand their reaches. So for that reason alone, we should let the whole act die, so we can have a conversation like this and have a debate out in the open, so we can figure out what we need to do, not just do everything possible and then scale it back. The other thing to keep in mind is, it's not a question of either or. It's not, we either have the Patriot Act or we don't. We either surveil people or we don't. There were plenty of procedures in place before this having to do with public courts and warrants, which is the way we've existed throughout most of our history. So the fact that we've gone to something a little bit more comprehensive and private should give us all pause, I think.
So, from what we've seen with how Edward Snowden's been treated, where he had to go to China and Hong Kong and give journalists things, and then gets run out of Hong Kong into Russia, stays there for 40 days, and then finally gets asylum. Do you think that will deter other people to be whistleblowers in the future, if they need to, they feel the need to whistleblow?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do. There are so many interesting questions. How many people had access to the things that Snowden had, and why did they do nothing? And in the event that, look how Manning's been treated in prison. Look at this government, and whatever the next government, the next president is going to do is going to be worse on civil rights and civil liberties. Hillary Clinton has an awful record. She says things every once in a while about the way she thinks about dictators in foreign countries that should basically, from my perspective, disqualifies her from being president. She's just awful, right? Absolutely awful on this issue. But if you're working in some of these agencies, why would you run the risk of being put in prison or being exiled to some awful country somewhere? to the extent that the government and the president want to stop something like this from happening in the future, they're doing all the right things. And Obama has said after Snowden that one of his criticisms of Snowden was that we were about to have this conversation anyway, so we didn't. What Snowden did was unnecessary, which I think is a little disingenuous.
Do you ever think that the government is going to get to the point where they almost throw away all the bills that they have in place and laws now, and we're going to start from the beginning with like a whole new framework of laws, like the Patriot Act, like you said?
I would prefer that we start with a whole new government. I'm not a big fan of Congress necessarily. I don't think so. I mean, our government, apart from the fact that it's a little too large and violating civil liberties and civil rights, it hasn't shown a willingness, especially in the last 7 or 8 years, to do things, much of anything, especially delicate things.
Yeah.
So we're probably not going to get to that point. The best thing that we could do is some of these laws have sunset provisions, which means that they'll die without being renewed, which is a good thing.
And getting back to the idea of how media portrays these issues, because obviously we know that all these major news outlets are owned by 6 companies. Fox News and MSNBC are just 2 sides of the same coin. So they're all putting different political spins on things. But if obviously these corporations are working with the government in order to protect, in order to perpetuate certain ideologies, how do you think the media is going about portraying like Edward Snowden and the issues that come about because of him?
Yeah, well, probably MSNBC and Fox probably have different spins, but they're definitely they're interested in the profit motive, right? So they tend to sensationalize things. Fox News sensationalizes certain kinds of things. MSNBC probably sensationalizes different things. I don't have cable, thankfully, so I just read my news. But I belong to a gym where they have that whole row of TVs, so I'm very. That's to the extent that I do my media analysis. Is I watch what they show during the day. But they're trying to lure people to watch, so they try to sensationalize things, and they're not. It's the era of the soundbite, and they don't do much analysis or in-depth reporting on some of the nuances about these laws. So probably, the biggest problem is that people select outlets based on what their preconceived notions are, right? So if they think that that the government ought to be doing everything within its power to protect us from Islamic extremists, they watch Fox all day, and they don't learn anything other than the right. Or if they think that Edward Snowden should be the next president, then they watch MSNBC all day, and they don't learn anything all day either. So it's partly the media's responsibility to instruct, but if people aren't seeking out information, then we're all to blame.
Besides not having like cable at your own house, in your personal life, do you do anything to protect your privacy? Like,
I try. I downloaded the Privacy Badger on my browsers, but I don't even know what that does. Privacy Badger could be owned by the government for as far. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but
yeah.
I have the iPhone. I have I was in New York over the weekend. I have one of those things where they automatically take money out of your bank account when you drive through the bridges and tunnels. So I'm being tracked that way because it's cheaper and it's also very convenient. So that was my earlier point, that if we want to do things to maintain our privacy, we have to really, really inconvenience ourselves in a way that we're not used to.
It's almost impossible just because of how much exposure we have to technology. And it's a good and a bad thing because we want to advance, and like technological advances, but at the same rate, are we leading into a 1984 reality because of it? Even if we're not trying to, just because we are so immersed in technology. We need, let's face it, that in society, you need technology to live, you need technology to work, So, but at the same rate, what are we risking, Yeah,
and technology gets more and more advanced, and there's all this momentum because of the security issues, because of the profit motives, that we need to be having these discussions now. When we need to try to put brakes on these things when possible, whenever we can, because at some point we're not going to be able to.
Yeah.
Right. So, a lot of countries, and when I lived in New York, they have cameras on some corners. Every once in a while, I'd get a ticket via the mail. They just saw me speeding somewhere, and they would give me a ticket. But between those and facial recognition, think about the possibilities for being tracked.
Yeah.
Right? So even if you decide that you want to pay cash with everything and you don't want to use a smartphone, they'll still be able to find you if they want to.
Everything is linked together.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and once we start combining where you go and who you talk with and what you pay, or what you pay for, what you're buying,
You could pretty much
and your
figure out a
healthcare
person's life.
information. Yeah, you can start constructing profiles of people
Yeah.
without ever having to do any direct surveillance, and that's really frightening.
I'd say. And I guess it all comes down to, I mean, obviously this all happened. The catalyst was 9/11, and it was to counteract cyber terrorism. But when you look at the actual statistics, a lot of these programs, the NSA, the prison programs, don't actually, like cyber terrorism isn't as much as a threat as our own like issues within America. Like, how do you feel about that? Like, do you think like this almost like fear mongering that the government kind of perpetuates through, oh, we need these systems of operation in order to counteract cyber terrorism? It is a smokescreen for something else.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing you can say about these programs, like waterboarding, for example, or enhanced interrogation, or what you want to call it, is they don't seem to work.
Yeah.
That we're not doing a good. I mean, we're gathering a lot of data, and we're not making good use of the data that we do have, and we're using fear and fear mongering to justify gathering all this information. When maybe what we really need is just some old-fashioned intelligence. Not boots on the ground, but footwork.
Yeah,
Footwork.
before the day of the internet.
Yeah.
Do you have any other questions?
So let's talk about more about Edward Snowden, and has he like, obviously there are people that are following in his footsteps. What have there been other people stepping up like Edward Snowden, kind of also like pioneering the way? I mean, maybe not to the same level of extremism that he did, but does he have like, are there any like other like notable people that are also like following in his footsteps?
I mean, there's a collection of, media elites and intelligentsia and professor types who are sort of using him or using the issue to champion for civil liberties and civil rights. But the kind of civil disobedience on that scale is kind of rare, and I can't think of any recent instances of that, unfortunately. And thankfully there's not an Edward Snowden every week, because that would indicate that things are really bad.
Yeah.
Things are really
True.
bad.
And did other countries, I wonder, because I mean, terrorism we saw in Brussels and in Paris and pretty much everywhere in the world, there's like, we keep hearing about all these terrorist attacks. I wonder if there are other people like Edward Snowden in other countries that are also paving the way for those particular countries.
Yeah, we had there was information about the Brussels attackers. So other countries are gathering information, maybe not as extensively, but they're also not doing a job that not as good of a job as they could with their data. And the other thing that the Snowden revelations taught us is that we're spying on other countries too,
Yeah.
which was kind of an embarrassment, including some of our allies. And if we really want to get serious about security, we'll see other countries as allies and help with that, rather than to see them as enemies. So that's one of the big areas that we can improve. Maybe not gathering more intelligence, but doing better with the intelligence we have, including with cooperating with countries that we call our friends.
Continuing off that, in the Citizen 4 movie, there was times where they had a few of the journalists were at other countries, and in Portugal they had a Senate meeting about it, and I know in Brussels they had a Senate meeting about it, and I don't really know if there was any Senate meeting about it in America, but does it make it seem like other countries are more worried about us spying on them than we are about being spied on by our government?
It seems to, yeah. I'm always shocked, although maybe I shouldn't be surprised, at public opinion polls and the extent to which people are willing to give government a free pass. And a lot of the European countries are better on privacy issues. And actually, the best thing that might happen for our privacy might not be the United States Congress. It might be the fact that Apple wants to sell iPhones in Europe. And they need to make sure that the privacy that they offer is on par with what the European laws state, rather than what American laws require them.
With all the information that the government's collecting on all of its citizens and people around the world, do you think that they could do a better job in stopping terrorist attacks like Brussels or anything else that's happened recently?
Well, I think we need to get to the point where we realize if people really want to harm us, they're going to be able to do it. So we need to accept a certain amount of risk in modern life, and not use fear to justify actions of any kind. But it's clear that we could be doing a better job stopping things. I mean, if we're really concerned about safety or health, we could do things about gun control or healthcare, the cost of healthcare.
Yeah.
So it seems strange that we've concentrated all our efforts on something that doesn't seem, in terms of the numbers, be that much of a threat compared with other things.
Gun violence in America or something else.
Perhaps, yeah.
Do you think there will be any point where Snowden will come back to America to try for a fair trial, or no? Do you think he's just going to stay in
Is he
asylum?
even able to?
Oh, they
he
would
could.
love to have him back, I'm
That's
sure.
right, yeah.
But is there a point
It's-
where it's safe for him to come back, do you think?
I think probably not in the immediate future. I think I've been disappointed with the current president. I'd be very impressed if he pardoned Snowden on his way out, which is perfectly in his right to do, to recognize. If he does recognize, as he says, that Snowden has made a contribution, or that we were going to have this discussion anyway, then pardoning Snowden would go a long way to saying that he recognizes that Snowden forced the conversation. So I'd like to see that. But like I said, I think whoever the next president is going to be is probably not going to be as good on the issues of civil liberties and civil rights. So the chances of Snowden ending up in prison are pretty high, and he knows that. So I also have no doubt that history will vindicate him, and we'll probably see him on par with Daniel Ellsberg, who was responsible for leaking the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times, someone who was doing civil disobedience for the sake of public service and democracy. That the people need to be informed to elect leaders, to make decisions and influence
Exactly.
policy. And if our government is lying to us and we're permitting it to happen, then the whole system crumbles.
And the
How,
fact that there is such a lack of transparency with these issues, why should it be hidden what's really going on with how the government tracks us or the information they gather? And the fact that we're not able to have that conversation without, getting exiled to Russia raises some questions. But that's it for Media Matrix. I'm Natalie, Cait, Anthony, and Peter. Thank you for coming on to our show and giving us your insight on these very important topics.
Thank you.